Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for the MJHA New Books on Japan series. My name is Sarah Kang, and I'll be your moderator for this session. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce our main speaker, Dr. Michiko Suzuki. Dr. Suzuki is a research scholar in the history of modern and contemporary Japan at the University of Tokyo. Her research focuses on the Japanese pre-war international movement within a humanitarian historical context. Her new book, titled Humanitarian Internationalism Under Empire, The Global Evolution of the Japanese Red Cross, 1877 to 1945, explores the Japanese notion of humanitarianism, Japan's interwar internationalism, and the Japanese Red Cross transnational movement by focusing on the Japanese immigration to the Asia-Pacific, Manchukuo, Hawaii, and Pan-American countries. Following Dr. Suzuki's presentation of her new book, we'll hear from Dr. Jessamyn Abel, who will be serving as our discussant today. Dr. Abel is a historian of modern Japan with interests in democratization, technology, infrastructure, sports, and international relations. Her current research focuses on post-war Japan to examine the ways in which institutions of daily life, such as the National Railway, the public broadcaster, the police, and parent-teacher associations, work to instill democratic practices and attitudes in the population. Her latest book, Dream Super Express, winner of the 2024 Modern Japan History Association Book Prize, views 1960 Japan through the window of the bullet train, showing how infrastructure operates beyond its intended use to perform cultural and sociological functions. Her first book, The International Minimum, examines the trans-war development of Japanese internationalism. She has also published on the Information Society, the Olympics, cultural diplomacy, textbooks, and the history of whaling. We'll be hearing from Dr. Abel, who will speak briefly after Dr. Suzuki's presentation, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A from the audience. At that time, please feel free to input your questions into the chat or raise your hand, and I will call on you to speak. All right, without further ado, Dr. Suzuki, I'll hand it over to you if you would like to share your screen.
Thank you for your excellent introduction. Oh. So is this working?
That looks great.
Okay. Is that okay to start? Okay. Thank you for inviting the Modern Japan History Association for this great book and talk series. Good evening or good morning in Japan, everyone. Thank you for the Modern Japan History Association inviting me for a new book talks on Japan series. I'm very delighted to be here. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Jessamyn Abel for inviting me to discuss my book and for taking the time to read my book for this event. It must be time consuming, but most of all, I want to express from the bottom of my heart gratitude to Professor Emeritus Stefan Vlastos, University of Iowa. I think that he's joining this evening. And for the past 4 years, he has mentored the completion of this book, and his insights and attentive eye to the uses and misuses of sources depended my understanding of history and the humanistic disciplines. So let's move on to my talk this evening. This short presentation is about my book, Humanitarian Internationalism Under Empire, The Global Evolution of the Japanese Red Cross Movement from 1877 to 1945, which was released by Columbia University Press last summer. It is the first research monograph in English on the history of the Japanese Red Cross movement, grounded in multi-archival Japanese and English language primary and secondary sources, thus contributing a growing body of scholarship on humanitarian ideologies and organizations that developed outside the West in the formative period up to the Second World War. These are the major archives that I used. The evidence that forms the basis of the book's revisionist narrative has been culled from multiple national, local, and personal archives in Japan, Switzerland, the US, the UK, China, Korea, and Brazil over a period of 20 years. The activities of the Japanese Red Cross Society, JRCS, in the pre-war period were global and transnational, so the record of its activities span continents. In Japanese archives, I even found their correspondences with Egypt, Afghanistan, Persia, Iraq, India, Sham, Cuba, and Latin American countries in the 1930s. My monograph recovers the history of the JRCS and with it the indigenous humanitarian movement in modern Japan from a reductionist historiography in both Japanese and English language historiographies that misrepresent the JRCS as a top-down organization wholly subordinate to the government and the imperial family and derivative of Western values and institutional models. It relocates the JRCS within a transnational discourse of peacetime and wartime international humanitarianism to which the JRCS contributed as much as it borrowed. The introduction also discusses what is a growing historiography on non-Western humanitarianism in the pre-Second World War period that is deconstructing the binary between humanitarianism in the West and the rest of the world. I explores the brief history of humanitarian movement in Asia, the Middle East and Africa, such as the Indian Red Cross Society, the Egyptian Red Crescent, the Chinese Red Swatika Society, and the Dutch East India Red Cross. Chapter 1 sets the stage by revising the historiography of the origins and development of the Red Cross movement in Japan, emphasizing its ideological and organizational melding of native and Western forms. It follows the society's evolution in the early 20th century with reference to wartime and peacetime relief activities. For example, Mount Bandai volcano relief of 1888, the First Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, World War I, the Spanish flu pandemic, the foundation of the League of Red Cross Society of 1919, currently the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC, and the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. Chapter 2 explores the JRCS humanitarian diplomacy during the 15th International Conference of the Red Cross, which convened in Tokyo in 1934 under the leadership of JRCS President Tokugawa Iesato, the 16th head of the Tokugawa family. The Great Depression, the 1931-1932, and the Manchurian Incident in 1931, the rise of National Socialism in Germany, Japan's withdrawal from the League of Nations in March 1933, and the resurgence of political and economic nationalism worldwide created an atmosphere of global uncertainty. Yet, amid rising international tensions, the conference anonymously adopted the Tokyo Declaration of 1934, which greatly expanded both wartime and peacetime protection of civilians. Although not ratified by the great powers, it became the foundation of the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949. Chapter 3 and 4 illuminate the JRCS's development from a national to a transnational humanitarian movement through case studies of overseas branch organizations in Korea, Manchuria, Hawaii, and Brazil. The JRCS expanded its presence overseas in tandem with Japanese emigration, which created a Japanese diaspora in Asia-Pacific region and imperial expansion on the Asian continent. In Korea and Manchuria, the JRCS played a vital role through the development of local medical facilities and public health in advancing colonial modernity. JRCS Hawaii served as an organizational bridge between local Japanese and American elites and facilitated diplomatic relations with the United States before and after strains in relations developed in the 1930s. JRCS's Brazil office acted as a vehicle for reinforcing Japanese identity among the Japanese immigrant community, which was facing coercive assimilation policies. Together, the case studies show that the overseas Japanese humanitarian movement embodied in the JRCS took the form of a multi-ethnic and multinational humanitarian organization that mobilized the Japanese immigrant community, engaged with local governing authorities, and enlisted the local populations in the humanitarian movement. Chapter 5 analyzes what the JRCS was able and enabled to do in fulfillment of its Red Cross mandate during the Pacific War to provide humanitarian assistance to Allied POWs, civilian internees, and forced laborers, as well as Japanese POWs and Japanese civilian interns by the Allied powers. JRC's activities were more nuanced, numerous, and varied than previously understood. To this end, the JRC seized every opportunity available to partner with the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and allied national Red Cross societies. To the extent permitted by Japan's wartime authorities and to the extent resources allowed, the JRCs administered to the needs of civilians in accordance with the Tokyo Declaration of 1934, known as the Draft International Convention on the Condition and Protections of Civilians of Enemy Nationality who are on territory belonging to or occupied by a belligerent. Chapter 6 brings to light the personal sacrifices and professional labors of the Red Cross battlefield nurses during the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombings in the context of the development of the JRCS nursing. It shows how principles of humanitarian professionalism guided JRCS nurses in the midst of a truly living hell as they rendered medical aid to civilians, soldiers, and Allied POWs without discrimination. Their emergency responses demonstrate the extent to which they had internalized their professional mission as medical aid givers and eventually emerged as exemplars of humanitarian relief ideal. In the conclusion, I linked the Japanese modern notion of humanitarianism to Japan's philosophical tradition by quoting Kamono Chomei's Hojoki. Kamono Chomei was a 12th century author, poet, and essayist who responded to contemporary crisis by bearing witness to human misery and came to terms with the eschatological world of human existence through the meditation of the Buddhist concept of impermanence, mujo. Kamono Chomei's essay reminds us that human suffering is universal and that human lives are ephemeral. Yet, even as he bore witness to the hell of the contemporary world, he recorded articles, acts of kindness and self-sacrifice by ordinary people that enabled community survival in an age of great turmoil. Kamono Chomei asks the reader where to find peace, what is the meaning of life, and how do we find meaning in our lives. The Hojoki stands as one of the great meditations on the human condition over the ages and continuing into the modern period. At times of great danger and uncertainty, Japanese have found solace in its pages. During the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers read Hojoki on the battlefield, as did Japanese civilians in Manchuria at the end of the war as they fled the Soviet invasion. More recently, so did the Japanese who lost loved ones and were driven from their homes by the Tohoku 2011 triple disaster of earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown. Let me briefly introduce the history of the JRCS before I move on to my research findings. The JRCS was founded in 1877. The early date of the founding of the JRCS and the rapid development of the society challenges the dominant Western-centric narrative of the modern humanitarianism as an exclusively Western origin and Christian-based charity organization or movement. From the beginning, native Japanese traditions of humanitarianism expressed in the Japanese notion of jindo, whose literal meaning is the way of humanity, infused the ethos of the JRCS. At the national level, the JRCS enjoyed the patronage of the Imperial Family, but organizationally, it developed into a strong grassroots movement that expanded its activities beyond medical aid to combatants in international conflicts. The rapid growth of the JRCS was made possible by involvement of thousands of ordinary people in humanitarian activities in the form of self-reliant efforts to survive social uncertainties such as poverty, natural disasters, epidemic diseases, and civil wars following the Meiji Restoration. By responding to local humanitarian crises as well as assisting the nation in Japan's foreign wars, the JRCS tapped into ordinary Japanese people's communitarianism and patriotism, and the society experienced a dramatic increase in membership to more than 2 million members in 1920. In 1945, the JRCS had more than 15 million members, including colonial subjects, which was far and away the highest among the National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies worldwide. From its earliest days, the JRCS promoted natural disaster and peacetime relief activities, both within Japan and on a global stage, including the foundation of the League of Red Cross Society of 1919, currently the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. The wartime relief activities of the JRCS also served as a model for a number of the amendments of the Geneva Conventions. The image on the right shows the cover of the JRCS monthly magazine published in 1934, symbolizing the Red Cross's goal to alleviate pain and suffering around the world. In this year, the JRCS hosted the 15th International Conference of the Red Cross in Tokyo. The society faced the dual challenges of maintaining its humanitarian mandate in the fraught context of the Japanese army's expanding military operations in China, the government's withdrawal from the League of Nations, the increasingly authoritarian domestic political context, and international context of the diminishing commitment of the great powers to the very principles of world peace and international law. The conference concluded with delegates anonymously adopting the Tokyo Declaration, which called for the protection of civilians during armed conflicts. The Tokyo Declaration was not endorsed by any of the great powers and not adopted by the LCRC in Switzerland before the eruption of the Pacific War, but principles enunciated in the 1934 Tokyo Declaration became the foundation of the Fourth Geneva Convention's provisions on the protections of civilian persons in time of war of 1949. This map shows the overseas locations of major JRCS departments and chapters before the Second World War. Beginning in the 1890s and continuing into the Second World War, the JRCS expanded overseas operations in tandem with Japanese imperialism and worldwide Japanese diaspora. Beginning in 1894, the JRCS opened chapters and branches in new imperial territories, including Korea, Taiwan, and Thereafter, and established overseas committee departments, some of which were temporary, while others lasted into the Second World War in Vladivostok, Chinese treaty ports, Hawaii, and Philippines. By the start of the Second World War, the JRCS had also opened overseas departments in North and South American cities that hosted large concentrations of Japanese nationals. During the Pacific War, the JRCS sent aid parcels to Japanese civilian internees in the US, the UK, and Oceania, and operated exchange repatriation operations with allied nation in Lourenço Marques, currently Mozambique's capital, Maputo, and Goa in India, and Vladivostok. Let me highlight some image in my book. The top photo shows an official photograph of delegates to the Tokyo Conference in 1934, the largest and most geographically diverse international Red Cross and Red Crescent conference of the interwar period. The guests included the recently decolonized countries such as Afghanistan, Iran, and Cuba. The photo at the bottom left shows a Japanese woman living in Hawaii who joins the American Red Cross. In Hawaii, some memberships of the JRCS and the American Red Cross overlapped, showing the transnational identity of the Red Cross in Asia Pacific. The photo at the bottom right shows Allied POWs in Nagasaki. Nagasaki had one of the largest Allied POW camps in Japan, and the JRCS was treating them prior to the nuclear bombing. The top photo on the left shows the opening of the JRCS assembly convened at the JRCS Korean headquarters located in Seoul. They discussed a number of issues related to the humanitarian crisis in East Asia. For example, the JRCS Korean headquarters hospital developed Korean professional nursing training. One of the most notable initiatives was the JRCS Korean headquarters provision of medical treatment and material aid to Koreans residing in the Greater Tokyo area injured or left destitute by the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake and the ensuing massacre of resident Koreans. The photo at the bottom shows the Central Hospital of the Manchukuo Red Cross Society. In addition to supporting military operations, JRCS colonial branches played a significant role for wartime relief activities and sanitation control in Asia. This pie chart shows the distribution of JRCS membership within the Japanese Empire as of 1945. As you see, 1/3 of the entire membership consisted of the JRCS in Korea. Both the JRCS Korea and Manchuria were multiple ethnic and multinational organizations. Okay, the book develops 5 research findings. The melding of Western and Japanese humanitarian traditions and organizational forms, the strong grassroots vector in the JRC's steady growth to become world's largest international organization by the First World War, the Society's pioneering role in Red Cross disaster relief and inclusion of non-Western national societies in the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, advocacy of comprehensive legal protections of civilians in wartime at the 1934 Tokyo International Red Cross Conference, and the evolution of the JRCS from a national into a transnational organization with scores branches, societies, both in Japan's overseas empire and in Asia Pacific and North and South America. The findings deconstructs the binary that still prevails in Western historiography between the development of modern secular humanitarianism in the West and in the rest of the world. In addition, the book provides a fresh vantage point to address large historical questions relating to Japanese modernization and internationalism before the Second World War. Okay, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Okay, well, that was a really great summary of the book and its main points and some of the important things about it. I would like to start by thanking you for writing such a terrific book. This book, I guess the folks who are here probably don't need convincing to read it since you bothered to come and hear Dr. Suzuki talk about it. But I do want to say that not only does it make a very important contribution by really a corrective to our the rather sparse English language scholarship on the Japanese Red Cross Society, but more broadly contributes to our understanding of Japan's participation in international organization, the history of Japanese humanitarianism, the relationship between non-governmental or semi-governmental organizations and the state in the imperial and wartime period. So this book does a lot for our field, and so kudos for writing such a wonderful book. I yeah, I loved it, but I also had so many questions, and so I've picked some of the questions that I really wanted to know the answer to for now, kind of in the order as I came up with them as I read the book. So let me start with this statement that you make very early in the book. You mentioned your personal connection to the Japanese Red Cross Society. And obviously, no two people would write the same book about any given topic, even presented with the same set of materials, I imagine. But I wanted to ask how you think that that personal connection shaped the book and the argument that it makes.
Okay. Before I joined the Red Cross, I had already interested in the history of the Japanese Red Cross and working on it as an MA level. And then I'm more focusing on like institutional ideologies and policies in general. But when I joined the International Red Cross Committee of the ICRC of the Tokyo Declaration, it's a really coincidence, but we experienced the Great Tohoku earthquake, a triple earthquake the triple disaster in 2011. And a real experience that all practitioners suddenly threw into the field in the dangerous situations. And I witnessed everybody, started the humanitarian operations while the most embassies, foreign embassies and international organizations closed their office and they evacuated to Osaka. But the Japanese Red Cross did not evacuate it and they did not stop, the operation. I'm just wondering, they're really curious about this kind of operations happening, what motivates Red Cross workers to save lives and provide relief to the victims amid such extreme risk. And this became my fundamental questions. And I really understood that the humanitarianism, the Japanese notion of the humanitarianism was developed developed through the actions of practitioners and aid workers on the ground level. So this was the biggest change of my research, angles. Before joining the Red Cross, I didn't recognize the individual practitioners on the the ground level. So this was the most, the most important things which the benefits, I would say, that connected to the Japanese, the Red Cross movement. So the personal connections to the Red Cross movement. So I really believe that the Japanese notion of humanitarianism, Jindo, was an ideal developed through the actions of people who sought to alleviate suffering and saving the needs of people in need. That's what I saw in the ground level, on the field level. So that changed my, the research questions during writing this book.
Yeah, well, that's what happens, right?
From policies and institutional ideologies.
Right. Thank you. That really provides some nice insight. So moving on to the actual cover of the book. So I definitely got at least that far. So the title uses one of the key phrases of the book, Humanitarian Internationalism. So I wanted to ask you about not just that phrase, but I also, in the very first chapter, I saw the phrase flipped to become not humanitarian internationalism, but internationalist humanitarianism. And obviously, I have thought about internationalism quite a lot. So I really got maybe a little too sidetracked in that way. Oh gosh, what do those two different phrases mean? So I wanted to ask, first of all, did you see those as potentially indicating two somewhat different meanings? I mean, did you intend for that phrase when you used it in the chapters, significantly when you're really talking about humanitarianism in that chapters, when you said internationalist humanitarianism, which is maybe why I started thinking about it. Did you mean for that to have a particular meaning, or were those just silly
Yeah,
things and I'm putting
yeah.
too much into
Actually,
it?
I'm not really clear in my mind. I mean, on the differences between two terms. I'm just I unintentionally use that. But if I say the humanitarian international, I think both humanitarian internationalism and international humanitarianism is a part of international movement. And if I think if it's different, I would say that humanitarian internationalism connotes more not only official movement by nation states, but also unofficial movement by individual peoples. So, say for example, in the chapter 4 in my book, I focus on JRCS Hawaii. There's individual members of the JRCS supported, the ARC, American Red Cross, for their World War I operations. And I think this is a kind of humanitarian internationalism of the individual, carried out by individuals. And also humanitarian internationalism is not only the into the Red Cross movement, but also something like unofficial movement, which have some mission, purpose for the people in the world. I mean, especially it's for the benefit for the people in the world. Say, for example, like athletics, human rights, conflict resolutions, cultural exchange. I think this kind of movement, supranational nation-state movement organization can be a part of humanitarian internationalism in the sense of my book. So I really want to know what do you think about the differences? I mean, you're a specialist of internationalist movement.
Well, it just really seemed to me that, especially because it was in the chapter on what was this Japanese development of the concept of humanitarianism, both leading up to and within the context of the Red Cross. And it seemed to me that that there was a focus on humanitarianism, and we're doing it in an international way, right? We're doing it as part of this international organization. So it was a kind of humanitarianism. And that's why I thought maybe you had done it on purpose, because elsewhere, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about the regular phrase humanitarian internationalism, whereas there it was almost seemed in many of the cases that you described, it seemed almost like there was a use of humanitarianism for the purposes of internationalism, right? And so I was wondering how the developments and activities of the JRCS were related to other forms of internationalist activities, the activities of internationalism, which really, I mean, you talked about this, well, this was regular people doing it, but if you say internationalist, it does have that word nation in it,
Yeah,
right?
nation.
So
Yeah.
it suggests and many of the examples you talked about were for the nation, like that it was promoting Japan's international position or something like that. So, yeah, so sorry, this is a really long-winded way to say, how do you see these activities kind of related to other forms of internationalist activities that the Japanese government or non-governmental organizations were pursuing at the time?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And I also want to ask that the humanitarian internationalism can be it's connotes the image like a meaning of the modernity, gone beyond the modernity. So the humanitarian internationalism emphasizes the age of humanitarians who encounter the international movement after the late 19th century. After the 19th century.
If not to harp too much on phrases, but just one other phrase that I found really interesting was soft diplomacy.
Yeah.
I actually, I've thought so much about soft power, but I honestly have never seen that phrase
Yeah.
before. And
Yeah.
I was interested in part because I couldn't quite decide what it meant. For from what I was reading. So sometimes I thought it was any activity that tended to increase a nation's soft power, right? So a means of promoting soft power and building up soft power resources. But it was not always clear to me if this was like an unintended impact of JRCS activities,
JRCS, yeah,
or if it was a purposeful activity, right? Like the leadership of the JRCS is consciously trying to promote Japan's international position.
yeah,
So I wasn't sure if it was an incidental effect or a purpose. So I wonder, could
yeah.
you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, I think it's both kind of. A soft diplomacy in my book is used in two sense in my book. So in some case, for in the perspective of the government found that JRCS was a very useful tool to promote or to enhance Japan's prestige and bring tangible benefits to local population. Say, for example, in Korea or Manchuria, and even during the 15th International Conference, they had a lot of exhibition, cultural exhibitions, and they found that it's really useful tool to make Japan's prestige in worldwide. But however, within the JRCS context, I used the soft diplomacy to refer to JRCS humanitarian activities intended to earn the goodwill and cooperation of local populations or government. So, for example, in Hawaii, as I told that the JRCS members, individual members, they supported American Red Crosses and World War I humanitarian operations, which also they wanted to gain and the goodwill or relationship with the United States. And also the Brazil case, it's more like the individual JRCS or officers of the JRCS, elite or JRCS members, get to gain goodwill. I mean, they supported Brazilian government, not like a local people, but governmental level. And it's also the project to gain goodwill with the government outside of Japan. So I think JS's project is to get the goodwill and cooperation of, government and colonial subjects outside Japan. So I use this soft diplomacy in this sense in my book, in case of JRCS.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful.
Hmm.
But in connection with that question, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the society's relationship to the Japanese government. So you mentioned it's a semi-governmental organization, right? But then there are times you describe when they're really struggling against government policies. But you've just described a case where they are trying to promote Japan's international prestige. So, yeah, especially, I wonder what is the significance of what you call, I think you called it a liminal position in the colonies, where the JRCS is maybe a tool of the process of assimilation, the policies of assimilation in the colonies, but at the same time, it's maybe a place where, for instance, I think in Korea, you said maybe local Koreans would not be suffer the kind of discrimination that they would in other institutional contexts related to the Japanese Empire. So all of that, could you explain that
Yes.
relationship to the government?
Yeah, very good questions. First of all, I really have to make sure for everybody that the Red Cross and none of Red Cross and Red Crescent societies were independent from the government. All of them are semi-governmental organization, not NGO in contemporary sense, like Amnesty International or Doctors Without Borders. It's different. It's because this was the invention of the post-war period. And so all national societies acted within the nation's framework in accordance with the Geneva Convention. So that's what I call semi-governmental organizations. So then JSS was not exception. Say, for example, the American Red Cross initially operated as the private founded relief or organization, but after the American acquired and overseas empires in 1898, the ARCS, American Red Cross, soon transformed into a quasi-official organization operating under a U.S. Congress charter. So this is the same. The JRCS was not exceptions. And about the colony, the Japanese overseas branches is mostly is complemented rather than conflicted with state policies, because it's also supporting like a Japan's government assimilations policy in Korea, the improving the health and public health and sanitation control, and also the JRCS improved a lot about the medical technology in colonial context. But I really want to emphasize that the colonial subject who joined the JRCS was not forcible. They voluntarily joined the Japanese Red Cross. So this is very different from the other international institutions. So many senior officials and leaders were consistent of local Korean subjects. So clearly the Korean people, they developed the humanitarian movement by themselves through joining the Japanese Red Cross during the colonial period in accordance to the Geneva Conventions. So in that sense, the Japanese Red Cross as an international organization was very different from other Japanese institutions in colony. The JRCS was very international and very domestic organization. So that's, I think, is a liminal sense.
But in terms of the relationship with the government in the chapter on war, it really seems like there is more and more struggle
Yes.
against certain government policies, so that their operations become more and more difficult when they're more and more needed, right? As there's war, during war is when there are these intensely needed humanitarian efforts, and that's when they're finding their jobs the most difficult. And I wondered sometimes as I was reading about, well, they couldn't do this because the government, or they couldn't do this thing that they used to do. And I wondered if it was a matter of self-restraint. Were they making sure not to like lose government support, or was there a change in administration? Were the leaders of the JRCS kind of deciding to go along with the government policies how did that work?
Yes, first of all, they changed the administration in order of the imperial armies, and they tried to fit into the reality to have treating the sick and wounded soldiers on the battlefield. So JRCS in 1938, the National State Mobilization Law and like a Kokasodoin law was introduced. The JRCS also changed its regulations to stay focused on the medical provision for soldiers of the Japanese Imperial Armies and Navy. So within the framework of course, the Geneva Convention. So it's like ideally and practically, it became the subordinate of the Imperial Armies. But the then the struggle was really true, and I think they have a very major two problems for the JRCS during the Second World War. One was that about the operation during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Both China and Japan did not declare the war, which means that it makes the Second Sino-Japanese War as the outside jurisdictions of Geneva Conventions. And it made the JRCS very difficult to treat Chinese POWs because the Japanese government did not admit POW status of Chinese. They did not declare war. They said it is just incident. It's not international armed conflict. So, for example, in 1946, International Military Tribunal for Far East, actually the Allied powered vessel with how to persecute Japan's war crimes against the Chinese, because Japanese claim that it's not armed conflict. We did not have a responsibility to the Chinese. Then another issue was that 1929 Geneva Convention of Prisoners of War, the Japanese government signed the 1929 Geneva Conventions, but did not ratify it. It also made the JRCS very difficult to treat Allied POWs. And so it's all related to some legal binding surrounding the JRCS, which makes the operation of the JRCS very difficult. And also the Tokyo Declaration of 1934, actually none of governments, none of great powers did respect this. So it's also the JRCS made very difficult to treat civilians internally, both in Japanese civilians and Allied civilians, including forced laborers from China and Korea. So this was made very difficult. But in case of treatment of the wounded and sick soldiers on the battlefield, it works very well because the Japanese government ratified the Second Geneva Convention. So they had a very, efficient relationship to operate to this kind of medical relief during the war. So I think the issue was a really like a legal binding surrounding the JRCS during the Second World War, which made the society activities very difficult to accomplish.
I see.
Hmm.
Well, their activities became perhaps much more difficult.
Yeah, even in reality, yeah, a lot of bombings, shooting.
Yeah, right. But
No,
then
this is
especially,
also another issues, but anyway, their security become extremely vulnerable on the battlefield. And during the Second World, more than 1,000 Japanese Red Cross workers were killed by Allied forces.
right,
And so they died a lot, and yeah. So
right.
this was another difficulty for the JRCS.
Mm.
Uh,
Perhaps even more so, the difficulty became even more intense, actually, in a way, at the end of the war, which you deal with
yeah,
in
yeah.
the last chapter on the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Hmm.
And one thing that really struck me about that chapter was that it was quite different from the previous
Hmm.
chapters in a couple of ways. First, the book proceeds mainly chronologically, and then this one is still next chronologically with the atomic bombings, but then suddenly, after introducing the bombs, the chapter itself jumps back for about 10 pages to talk about the history of nurse training. So there's this sort of stepping outside of that chronological process to take a look back for a moment. And the
Hmm.
second difference was that this one just had so many personal accounts from
Yeah.
Red Cross nurses. This is what I saw. This is what I did. This is what I thought. So it had a different feel than previous chapters.
Hmm.
So I really want to ask you to talk a little bit about your thinking behind the decisions to do those two things, which you hadn't done before, and so why did you do them here? Why?
Yeah. So the humanitarianism, the Japanese notion of Jindo, I think it really encompass in on the ground level, on the field level. So maybe it's related to your first questions, but my core question of this book was why the Red Cross worker provide relief such extreme risk, and why they did not withdraw, why they didn't complain about their situations. They just continue. This is just unbelievable for me. But I wanted to know the motivation behind the psychology. Then I started to go back to their training process. It was a very intensive, and I found that it was really like a quasi-military training, but also learning a lot about the Geneva Conventions and the medical technical services. Then I found that that's why, because of their intensive training, they never withdraw from their operations, which I called humanitarian professionalism. And so in chapter 6, I really wanted to argue that to comprehend my book about the humanitarian concept, their responses demonstrated exemplars of humanitarianism in the post-war period. And also, probably if you see like a humanitarian in Japanese notion, it could connote the peace and rejections for violence, which continue into the post-war period. But so that's why I just a little bit focus on this kind of ground level, because in the ground level, the complete chaos, no institutional ideology, no orders. There is only individual aid workers on the ground in the front of the suffering people and Japan's people. And in that kind of, this is the reality of the history of humanitarianism on the ground level. If you see the Gaza or Ukraine, there's a lot of people dying and the dead bodies on the field. And they need the actions to treat the people. That's why I really wanted to say focus on the practitioners, history of practitioners, which beyond the institutional logics and orders.
Right. I think you accomplished that very well in that chapter. I think that was a good couple of choices that you made there. Well, I don't want to take up all the time. I'm sure other people have questions. So I'll stop asking and maybe let someone else have a turn.
Sure. Thank you both for that really engaging discussion. I learned so much from both of you. So maybe we can now turn to Q&A. So those of you in the audience, please feel free to raise your hand and speak, unmute yourself and ask your question, or you can also put your question into the chat and then I'll read them out for you. Great questions. Okay. Dr. Suzuki, can you see? I can't see the questions.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can, or maybe it's just me.
No, I don't see it.
Okay.
Mm.
Let's just wait for the questions to come in. And maybe you can choose one of the three if you'd like.
I don't see questions.
Mark, we're
Any
not
questions?
questions. If you could put them
Can
separately,
you read or?
or if you can read them out loud, that would be great.
Yeah.
Oh, here we go. Okay, so the first question is, what was their criteria for membership in the JRCS society? What was expected of the membership?
So it became the world largest, the organization in the pre-war period. It was like a due-paying memberships. So once, say for example, after 1937, the JRCS used the Chonaikai to increase the memberships. So each members of the Chonaikai pay the membership fees, and which includes the JRCS membership fees. So which means that if you became the member of Chonaikai, the people automatically became the membership of the JRCS. That's why it became such a large organization. And they also expected, it's like an insurance. If you think about the current national health insurance system in Japan, it's like a mutual aid, self-reliant effort within the country. That's why people donated to the Red Cross as a mutual aid. It's not like a purely volunteer, but more like a tax and taxation to prepare for the massive natural disasters before the Second World War. So membership doesn't mean necessarily the officers who got the wages, nurses or doctors.
Okay, the second question is, in your conclusion, you note that the main difference between the Japanese and American Red Cross was that the former was managed or administered by men, while the latter featured both men and women. How significant is that to their development?
Yeah, the gender is the most different things between the American Red Cross and Japanese Red Cross. Actually, the most male dominated in the management level of the JRCS. And actually, this was changed. This is going to be changed during the occupied period, the American occupied period after 1945. So mostly pre-war period, women served as nurses, and they acted the most dangerous. They worked in the most dangerous situations in the pre-war, during the wartime. Did I answer the questions?
Do you think that significantly changed the development of the Japanese Red Cross versus the American Red Cross over time?
Yeah, I mean, the genders, the differences of the gender, I think is the different development. So the JRCS was more focused, women more focused on nursing
Mhm.
operations. Not, if you see the senior official management level, there's no woman in pro-war period.
Any other questions? I think Mark has one more question that might be coming, but in the meantime, others, please feel free to include. Oh, there we go. One from Tianju. How did the JRCS operate with this large size organization around the globe? Did JCRS in different regions keep communication with each other?
Ah, very interesting. Actually, a safe example, the Brazil, JRCS Brazilian Red Cross. I mean, JRCS Brazil and JRCS Montreal, I don't think they communicated to each other that much. It's really multinational, multiracial, and independently active. So each JRCS branches were very independent, very different. So they had a very different purpose of missions. Say, for example, in Brazil, they provided, I mean, medical service for Japanese immigrants, mainly because the Japanese immigration community was much more isolated than people in Hawaii. The Japanese immigrants in Hawaii are much more mixed with the American people and the local other nationalities. But in Brazil, it was very isolated. So that's why they provided medical aid for this immigrant community. So it was very different, and it's a very varied and diverse about the Japanese branches in overseas.
But
And the JR,
if could I hop in on that? Did each they were not communicating with each other, but did each have a fairly strong connection with the Japan
headquarters,
headquarters?
headquarters in Tokyo, yes. But it was very individual, I would say.
All right, there's a third question from Mark. During the 1920s, a number of organizations advocated for humanitarianism, peace, etc., but most of them succumbed to Japanese government censorship and disbanded. Why do you think that the JRCS managed to retain and practice its humanitarian mission on a transnational level in spite of its direct support for the Imperial Army and Navy?
Direct support for the Imperial Navy, which is only happened in after 1937. But before 1937, JRCS was much more independent. And in my book, in chapter 2, the Japanese government really found that the JRCS is a very useful tool for, the diplomatic relationship to make Japan's prestige, as Abel pointed out about the international humanitarianism and soft diplomacy. And also in Korea, like Manchuria, the individual local colonial subject voluntarily joined the JRCS to improve their, the conditions, like such as medical technologies and healthcare, public healthcare, that kind of thing. So it's not really forcible, but people individually joined the JRCS in general. So I don't think it's really had tensions between the mission of the JRCS and Japanese government pre-1937. Even the Japanese government are very happy to have the Japanese Red Cross, which promoting, sanitation control in Korea or colonial territories, and having international conference in 1934 to make Japan's prestige worldwide.
I would add that is a very similar story to other international
Yes,
groups, in internationalist groups rather,
yes,
in Japan.
yeah. So Japan is not exception. If you see like a British Red Cross in colonial territory, it seems to be like very similar. American Red Cross too, and like American Red Cross Philippine branch did quite similar things to the Japanese Red Cross.
But I mean also within Japan, right? Like different the government really recognizing, okay, well, we've left the League of Nations, but we can still get these benefits through things like
Yeah,
the Red
yeah.
Cross.
So they did not reject to invite League of Nations to the 1934 conference because government still found that the connection to having League of Nations very beneficial for the Japanese government, even though they withdraw. So through the Japanese Red Cross, they wanted to keep the connection with the international community.
Mhm. We have another question from Chiro Yamanaka. The question is, could you explain the relationship between the Red Cross and the Emperor and Empress? Did the Imperial Family provide financial support? I think the government policy and the Emperor were different entities at that time, and the Emperor had an exceptional meaning compared to today.
Yeah, very good questions. Actually, the Imperial families are biggest patron of the Japanese Red Cross. And after the Meiji Restoration, of course, there is a former Tokugawa vassals and also the new Meiji people. There is an armed conflict, you know, in the civil war, kind of civil war in Japan. And in order to make the Japan united, Imperial family was really important to be at top. I mean, the patron of the JRCS to provide all medical relief to the different groups of Japanese armed forces. And also in the Meiji, there's a lot of huge, protests against the JRCS by Shintoist and Buddhist monks. They believe that the Japanese Red Cross was the Christian-based charity organization, and they hated like a kind of the Western ideologies. So the Japanese Red Cross made the imperial family as a patron of the JRCS, which the Buddhist monks and Shintoist groups accepted the JRCS as a non-religious universal humanitarian organization. So in that sense, imperial family had a very important role for the foundation of the JRCS in early Meiji. And also one of the largest, fund, the Emperor Shoken Funds, International Red Cross, which exists even today, was the largest peacetime relief operations for the International Red Cross communities. So the imperial family also kind of promoted natural disaster relief on the global stage through the Japanese Red Cross. So they are the great patron of the Red Cross. And I think it's a tradition of the Japanese imperial family to involve in humanitarian relief and public health care since ancient time.
I have a question relating to your decision to end the book in 1945. I couldn't help but notice on your bio you mentioned you're interested in the Red Cross in the Cold War period. So you just mentioned um, the Imperial family also is very much involved in the Red Cross after World War II and dealing with refugees and repatriation and such. So I was wondering whether potentially there's a second book you have in mind with the Cold War context, or if it was just for the purposes of wrapping up neatly with the end of the war that you end in 1945.
Yeah, I found sense to write about the Cold War period. It's continued, even though it's, the society was just all bombed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think there's still after the Allied occupations period, there are a lot of operations going on, the repatriations and the connections with immigrants in Brazil and Hawaii, that kind of thing. So I really want to focus on that period. So it's going to be one of my plans for the next projects, hopefully. And Cold War period is very different from in the sense of the Japan, because empire ended suddenly in 1945 and it became into the Cold War period. So I'd like to see how it's different from the Britain or US in that sense. And trans-war period is going to be one of the key aspect for my next project.
Great, wonderful. I'm really excited to see how that pans out. If there are no other questions, maybe I'll give 1 or 2 minutes to see if any other questions pop up. Um, but if not, I think maybe we can just wrap it up at this point. Okay. All right. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your time and intellect with us. Um, uh, Thank you to everyone who joined us today and participated in this book talk. If you haven't already, I hope you get the chance to read Dr. Suzuki's book. I think it's on Amazon and also on Columbia University Press website. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thanks for joining this evening.
You.